It was described to me as just a journalistic label earlier on, Megan. So maybe this doesn't matter to you, whether we're in a recession or not. The data is the data, and that's what you're working off. You weigh in, though, on whether you think this is a recession.
Yeah, I think so. Our economists generally believe that we're going to be landing ourselves in a recession by the end of this year. Whether or not Q2 puts us there, is a moot point. One thing that we haven't really seen slow yet, of course, is the employment data. That's likely to come in our expectation, probably more so in the coming months. But yeah, I mean, this is actually helpful for the Fed in terms of them wanting to get inflation under control, right? The method that they're going to use to do this is slowing the economy. And that negative GDP number is a reflection of that.
So the only thing that was really holding it up was the 1% increase in personal spending, and that was mostly driven by services.
Yes.
But people are drawing down their savings now. It's at the lowest level since 2016, and then prices are continuing to stay high. At what point do you think that also rolls over?
Yeah, so right now people are really trying to keep up with the increases in prices that we're seeing across oil, food, clothing. And at some point, they're going to have to shift their spending to discretionary things, right? Currently, people are trying to take that summer vacation, enjoy the next few months. But once we move to the fall period, that's really when we're going to anticipate this slowing in spending on services. And hopefully, in our view, the inflation data is going to reflect that as well, because services is really still coming in so hot on the inflation numbers as well.
Megan, how do you think that what is the Fed reaction function to us going into a technical recession? We've heard a lot about, well, we heard Jerome Powell being asked and talking a lot about how he doesn't think that we're really in a recession. And I'm sure that, we've heard a lot about how they're focused on inflation. And yes, they acknowledge weaker data, but maybe that was the market clutching for dovish straws. Do you think then that the Fed, I mean, how far away is any Fed pivot around the weakness in this data, given the political pressure that will build if we are labeling this a recession?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question here. So yesterday, I would say that we're beginning to hear some signs of that Fed pivot, right? Powell really endorsed this message of data dependence. It's not just this blind march to a higher policy rate. Now they're at a setting that they would consider neutral, within the range of neutral. And they're going to have to be a little bit more thoughtful from here about whether or not to continue to deliver these supersized rate hikes. And we saw the market consistently, interpret that message as a bit dovish yesterday. We're, of course, continuing to see that in the price action this morning. And that steepening of the Treasury curve is really reflecting that. Mm-hmm. Just uncertainty around what the Fed is necessarily going to have to do at the September meeting.
But at the same time, he talked a lot about referring to the summary of economic projections from the last meeting, which would imply continued rate hikes in 2023 when the market is not expecting that. So I get, in some extent, why it was taken dovishly, but what's the room for a hawkish surprise now?
Yeah, so, Alex, I would say that it really is just going to come down to the inflation data and the employment data. Between now and September, we get 2 more CPI releases, we get 2 more payrolls reports. That's going to be how the Fed is going to decide what comes next from here. Now that they're in this comfortable range of neutral, it's the question of how much more hawkish they will need to be. And that information will come down to how quickly the economy is indeed slowing. Because that's ultimately how they're going to be able to fix this inflation problem.
Megan, what kind of delay, what kind of lag do you think about when you think about how effective Fed policy is? Because that's a sort of disconnect, isn't it, between data and Fed reaction. Yes. I wonder what kind of lag we should assume.
Yeah, that's a very important question here, too. And it was something that Powell specifically pointed to in the press conference yesterday, which made us interpret his responses a little bit more dovish there. I would say Fed policy kind of happens in 2 different channels, right? It's their communication about what's going to come next, which is what the Treasury curve is pricing. As Alex just pointed out, we're already beginning to see those mortgage rates come down a little bit on that anticipated Fed turn that we're likely to see in the second half of next year. But you also need to consider the impact that they've had already on the Fed's balance sheet, on the hikes that have been delivered. I would say that lag probably the pass-through to the economy is not necessarily immediate. You probably see that in about 6 to 12 months' time in the turnover in the inflation numbers.
Okay, so should we have 2-year yields currently priced right now at 2.86%?
Yeah, I would say that it really comes down to what you anticipate the Fed to do over the next few months here. Right now, I would say that if you're anticipating this Fed that will only peak out at around 3.5% as we do, and then need to cut in the second half of next year, that number seems pretty consistent with that path. If indeed, Alex, though, we don't see those inflation numbers come back down, that really leaves that hawkish room for the market to need to price a more aggressive policy path from here. But really, it's in our view, we need the 2-year rate does reflect our baseline expectation for what the Fed's going to do, but there is still so much uncertainty, which comes down to the inflation numbers.
And does the 2-10s inversion still make sense, Megan, and the extent that we're seeing of that inversion?
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely correct. We anticipate that the 2-10s curve will continue to reflect that inversion, continue to flatten. And that's really because of what the Fed needs to do here, right? They need to be able to bring rates to a more aggressive policy stance, which is what the market's currently reflecting, but at the same time, slow growth. And those growth slowdown concerns are usually more so felt in longer dated tenors. So think 10-year, 30-year, and out. And that's really the core reason why you're going to be seeing this inversion, because the market's going to have to price the Fed cutting from that aggressive stance as they bring rates back down when the economy cools, and ultimately, in our view, we end up in a recession.